The wind cut through the cottonwoods like a blade, rattling bare branches against a sky the color of old iron. 20 below, maybe colder, the kind of cold that turned spit to ice before it hit the ground. Ruby May. Dalton's fingers were blue where they gripped the root cellar door, the rusted hinges groaning as she pulled it open just wide enough to slip through. Inside, the dark smelled of earth and stored apples and something deeper, older, the scent of the place that held things safe through winter. Her breath came in white gasps as she crouched low, reaching for the nearest crate. 3 apples. That was all. 3 half-frozen apples with soft spots she could cut away, enough to keep Pearl and James alive, another 2 days if she was careful. The flashlight beam caught her full in the face. "Thief!" Miguel's shout cracked the frozen air. Ruby bolted, made it 5 yards before her legs gave out and she went down hard on the ice-crusted ground, the apples scattering from her threadbare coat. The world tilted, went gray at the edges. She heard boots crunching closer, felt rough wool against her cheek as someone knelt beside her. "Easy now." The voice was low, weathered. "Miguel, get Doc Whitmore. Move." Mutt's strong hands lifted her, and through the haze, Ruby felt something cold press against her chest. The silver locket. She always wore it, the only thing left of her mother. The man holding her went still. "Anna." The word came out like a prayer. "Christ, this is Anna's girl." The ranch house was warm enough to hurt. Ruby's skin burned as feeling came back to her fingers, and she bit down hard on her lip to keep from crying out. She sat rigid in a wooden chair by the stone fireplace, wrapped in a quilt that smelled of cedar and wood smoke, while the man, Silas Brennan, Miguel had called him, poured milk into a tin pot and set it over the stove. "Drink this when it's ready." His voice was quiet, matter-of-fact. No pity in it, which Ruby was grateful for. Pity was worse than cold. She nodded, not trusting herself to speak. Through the window, she could see Miguel leading Pearl and James up from the wagon, the little ones stumbling on legs too weak to hold them steady. James's face was gray, his lips cracked and bleeding. Pearl kept her eyes on the ground like she'd learned to do when strangers were near. The door opened. A woman in a dark wool coat swept in, medical bag already open. "Where are they?" "Kitchen," Silas said. "The baby's worst off." On Doc Whitmore, Ruby remembered her from when she was born, remembered kind hands and a voice that didn't lie, knelt in front of James and tilted his face toward the light. Her jaw tightened. She pulled out a stethoscope, listened to his chest, then moved to Pearl. When she finally turned to Ruby, her expression was carefully neutral. "How long since you ate? Really ate, not scraps." Ruby's throat closed. 6 weeks, maybe 7. Where are your parents?" "Mama died when James was born. Papa left 2 months later. Said he'd send for us when he found work in Billings." She paused. "That was October." Doc Whitmore's eyes flickered to Silas. Something passed between them, some wordless conversation Ruby couldn't read. The doctor stood, wiping her hands on a cloth. "These children need rest, regular meals, and warmth. Another week in that wagon, and you'd have buried the baby." She said it flat, clinical, but Ruby heard the anger underneath. "I'll come back tomorrow to check on them." The door hadn't closed behind her when the sound of hoofbeats made Silas move to the window. His hand went to the rifle propped by the door, and Ruby's stomach turned to ice. "Miguel, take the children upstairs." "Mr. Brennan, now." But it was too late. The door banged open and a man in an expensive coat strode in like he owned the place. He was tall, clean-shaven, with eyes that took inventory of everything they touched. When his gaze landed on Ruby, she felt it like a physical weight. "Brennan." He didn't offer his hand. "Heard you had some excitement this morning." "News travels fast, Hargrave." "Small town." Clayton Hargrave pulled a folded paper from his coat, smoothed it on the table. "This is the foreclosure notice for the Dalton homestead. 3 miles east, burned out soddy. Tax delinquent for 18 months. Bank takes possession in 90 days unless someone settles the debt." Silas picked up the paper, scanned it. "What's the amount?" $47. Hargrave's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Of course, that's just back taxes. The original mortgage was $200, and there's interest. The Daltons are dead. Mortgage doesn't die with the borrower. Debt passes to the estate." He looked at Ruby again. "Which means these children inherit the debt along with the land. Though I can't imagine what use a burned-out quarter section is to a pack of orphans." Ruby's hands clenched in the quilt. She wanted to tell him they weren't orphans, that Papa was coming back, but the lie stuck in her throat. Silas set the paper down carefully. "Children can't inherit debt in Montana. Law's clear on that." Law's clear on a lot of things." Hargrave buttoned his coat. "Also clear on vagrancy. Harboring vagrant children without legal custody is a misdemeanor. Sheriff Tate's a reasonable man, but he's got a job to do. These children were starving, and now they're fed. Christian charity, I'm sure. But charity has limits, doesn't it?" He moved toward the door, paused with his hand on the frame. 3 months, Brennan, then that land's mine. And these vagrant children? He let the sentence hang. Well, the state has facilities for that sort of thing. The door closed. Silas stood motionless for a long moment, staring at the foreclosure notice. When he finally looked up, his eyes found Ruby's. You heard all that. It wasn't a question. Ruby nodded. Your mama, Anna Dalton, she worked here once? Ruby touched the locket at her throat. Long time ago, before I was born. She never talked about it much. Something flickered across Silas's face. Pain, recognition, something else Ruby couldn't name. He turned back to the stove, poured the warm milk into 3 cups. Drink this, then sleep. Tomorrow, we figure out what comes next. But Ruby had already figured it out. They had 90 days before Hargrave took the only thing left of her family. 90 days before the state came for Pearl and James. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the windows. Ruby wrapped her hands around the warm cup and wondered if 90 days was enough time to learn how to fight. Sunday came cold and bright. Silas drove them to church in the wagon. Pearl and James bundled so deep in blankets only their eyes showed. Ruby wore a dress Doc Whitmore had brought, blue calico, clean but patched at the elbows. It hung loose on her thin frame, and she kept tugging at the sleeves like she could make herself fit into it. The church bells rang clear across the frozen prairie, and Ruby felt each peal like a hammer strike. She'd been to church before, back when Mama was alive, but that was a different girl, in a different life. This girl was a thief who'd collapsed stealing apples. This girl came with a debt she couldn't pay, and siblings she couldn't feed. The congregation turned as they entered. Mrs. Gunderson's eyes traveled from Silas to the children and back again, her mouth pursing like she'd bitten to something sour. The whispers started immediately, not loud, but Ruby heard them anyway. She'd learned to hear whispers the way animals learn to hear predators. Charity case. 3 of them, can you imagine? That Dalton girl? The one whose father... Silas's hand settled on Ruby's shoulder, firm and steady. Hold your head up, he said quietly. You've got nothing to be ashamed of. But shame wasn't something you could logic away. It lived in your bones. And Ruby's bones knew the truth. She was a burden, a weight around the neck of a man who owed her nothing. The service passed in a blur of hymns Ruby didn't know and prayers that felt aimed at someone else. Afterward, the congregation filed outside to the church hall where tables sagged under the weight of the potluck. Fried chicken and cornbread and green beans swimming in bacon grease. More food than Ruby had seen in months. Go on, Silas said. Eat. But eating meant walking past all those eyes, all those whispers. Pearl grabbed Ruby's hand, her small fingers cold despite the gloves. James pressed against Ruby's other side. Together they moved toward the tables like they were crossing a battlefield. Ruby was reaching for a plate when her elbow caught the edge of the gravy boat. It tipped, spilled, sent brown liquid cascading down the front of her borrowed dress. The hall went quiet. Oh, honey, Mrs. Gunderson's voice carried. That's the second dress you've ruined this week, isn't it? Some people just aren't used to nice things. Ruby stood frozen, gravy soaking through to her skin. Around her, the silence pressed in like a physical thing. She wanted to run, wanted to disappear, wanted to be anywhere but here, with all these people, watching her fail at something as simple as holding a plate. Then Doc Whitmore was there, napkin in hand, wiping at the stain with quick, efficient movements. Happens to everyone, Ruby. Last month, I knocked an entire pie off the dessert table. She looked up, eyes hard. Isn't that right, Margaret? Mrs. Gunderson's face colored. Well, And the month before that, your husband spilled punch all over Reverend Clay's good shoes. Doc kept wiping, kept talking, her voice carrying to every corner of the hall. Funny how some accidents are worth mentioning and some aren't. The tension broke. Conversations resumed. Ruby felt Doc's hand squeeze her arm. Quick, private, a wordless message of solidarity. But the damage was done. She could feel the weight of judgment settling over her like a second skin. They left as soon as they could. Silas drove in silence, jaw tight, while Pearl and James dozed in the wagon bed. Ruby stared at her hands, at the gravy stains that wouldn't come out, and wondered how long before Silas decided she wasn't worth the trouble. The answer came Monday morning. Sheriff Tate arrived just after dawn, his horse's breath steaming in the cold air. He dismounted slowly, like a man with an unpleasant task ahead of him. Silas met him at the door, but Ruby could hear every word from where she stood in the kitchen, pretending to wash dishes. Got a complaint filed with the county. Says you're harboring vagrant children without legal custody. Who filed it? Does it matter? But the sheriff's tone said it did. Said he knew exactly who, and didn't like it any better than Silas did. Law's the law, Brennan. You want to keep these kids, you need to petition the court for temporary guardianship. Otherwise, I'm obliged to place them with the county. How long do I have? Judge Caldwell's circuit comes through Friday. You'll need to make your case then. Sheriff Tate lowered his voice. For what it's worth, I hope you do. But Hargrave's got papers that say the Dalton homestead debt transfers to the children, says they're wards of whoever holds that debt. That's not how inheritance law works. Maybe not. But Hargrave's got lawyers, and you've got 3 hungry kids. Judge might see it different than you'd like. He climbed back on his horse. Friday, Brennan, courthouse. Don't be late. Ruby watched through the window as the sheriff rode away. Behind her, she heard Silas's boots on the wooden floor, heard him pick up the coffee pot and pour slowly, thinking. You heard of that too. Ruby turned. Yes, sir? Friday, I go before Judge Caldwell and ask for temporary custody. He'll want to know why. Why a 52-year-old widower with no children wants to take on 3 orphans he barely knows. You could tell him about Mama working here. Silas's hand tightened on the coffee cup. Your mama... He stopped, started again. Anna Dalton worked here in 1917, 15 years ago. Long time to remember a hired hand. But something in his voice said he remembered more than that. Something in the way he looked at the locket around Ruby's neck said Anna Dalton had mattered more than he was willing to admit. Outside, the wind carried the smell of coming snow. Ruby thought about Friday, about standing in front of a judge, about Hargrave's cold eyes and his talk of state facilities. 90 days had seemed like forever when Hargrave first said it. Now it felt like borrowed time they couldn't afford. Friday morning arrived with low gray clouds and the promise of more snow. Ruby dressed carefully in the blue calico, scrubbed the gravy stains until her knuckles were raw, braided her hair so tight it pulled at her scalp. Pearl and James stayed behind with Miguel's wife, but Ruby insisted on coming. Whatever the judge decided, she wanted to hear it from his mouth. The courthouse sat on the edge of Crestview's town square, a squat brick building that smelled of old paper and wood polish and something metallic Ruby couldn't name. Fear, maybe, or justice. She wasn't sure there was a difference. Judge Caldwell was a gray man, gray hair, gray suit, gray eyes that gave nothing away. He listened while Sheriff Tate read the complaint, while Silas explained how he'd found the children half-starved in his root cellar, while Hargrave's lawyer argued about vagrant laws and inherited debts. Then Doc Whitmore stepped forward. She carried a leather folder, thick with papers. When she opened it, Ruby saw photographs. Pearl's hollow cheeks, James's distended belly, the frostbite scars on Ruby's fingers. Medical charts with numbers Ruby couldn't read but understood anyway. Numbers that said how close they'd come to dying. These children were 6 weeks malnourished when Mr. Brennan found them, Doc said, her voice clinical, precise. The infant had pneumonia. The middle child showed signs of chronic dehydration. Ruby here. She looked directly at Ruby. Ruby was 2 days from organ failure. The courtroom was quiet. Judge Caldwell studied the photographs, his gray face giving nothing away. Another week, and you'd have been notifying next of kin instead of filing custody papers, Doc continued. Mr. Brennan saved their lives. Now the question is whether we let him continue that work or we punish him for it. Hargrave's lawyer stood. No one's punishing anyone, Your Honor, but sentiment doesn't change the law. These children have no legal guardian. The debt on their property passes to whoever assumes custody. Mr. Brennan may have acted charitably, but Mr. Brennan acted like a human being, Doc cut in, which is more than I can say for some people in this room. Judge Caldwell raised a hand. That's enough. He looked at Silas. Why do you want custody, Mr. Brennan? And don't tell me it's pure charity. Nobody takes on 3 children out of pure charity. Silas was quiet for a long moment. Ruby watched him, saw the way his jaw worked, saw him reach some decision. Their mother worked for me once, long time ago. She was a good woman, and I owed her. He paused. Still do. Owed her what? A debt I can't explain in a courtroom. Something flickered in the judge's eyes. Understanding, maybe, or respect for a man who knew when to keep his mouth shut. He looked down at the papers in front of him, at Doc's photographs, at the county's vagrancy complaint. Temporary custody granted, 30 days while the court investigates lineage and determines legal standing. He brought his gavel down once, sharp. Mr. Brennan, you'll report to this court monthly. Any concerns about the children's welfare? We revisit this decision. Understood? Yes, Your Honor. Good. Next case. Outside, the wind had picked up. Ruby stood on the courthouse steps, breathing hard, trying to understand what had just happened. 30 days. They had 30 days. Ruby May. Silas's voice pulled her back. Come on. I want to show you something. Mom. He led her away from the courthouse, past the general store and the bank, out to where the town gave way to prairie. In his hand he carried a wooden case, polished and worn. When he opened it, Ruby saw brass gleaming against green felt. Surveyor's transit, Silas said, used for measuring land, marking boundaries, settling disputes about who owns what. He lifted it out carefully, the brass cold and heavy in the winter air. Your mama's land, the Dalton homestead. Hargrave says it's worthless, says the debt's worth more than the property, but he's lying. And how do you know? Because I surveyed it myself 20 years ago when your grandfather bought it. Quarter section of good grazing land, spring-fed creek, timber rights. Not worthless, not even close. He set the transit on its tripod, adjusted the eyepiece. Come here, look through this. Ruby pressed her eye to the cold metal. The world jumped into focus. Distant fence posts, the line of the horizon, everything measured and precise. See those markers? The wooden stakes? Silas's voice was steady, teaching. Those mark the boundaries of your family's land. Hargrave wants that land, Ruby. Wants it bad enough to foreclose on 3 orphans. Question is why? Ruby pulled back from the eyepiece. What can we do about it? Right now, nothing. But in 30 days, if the court decides in our favor, we can fight him legal. He folded the transit back into its case. And if we're going to fight, you need to know what you're fighting for. Your land, your inheritance, your future. The weight of it settled on Ruby's shoulders, not crushing, but present, real. For the first time since Mama died, since Papa left, since everything fell apart, Ruby felt something besides hunger and fear. She felt possibility. Will you teach me? The words came out before she could stop them. To use that, to measure things. Silas looked at her for a long moment, then he nodded. Every evening after chores. We'll start tomorrow. As he handed her the wooden case. Carry this. It's yours to learn. Ruby took it, felt the weight of brass and wood and something else. Responsibility, maybe. Or hope. She wasn't sure there was a difference. Behind them, church bells rang the hour. 30 days, Ruby thought. 30 days to learn, to grow strong, to figure out how to fight a man who had the law and the money and the town on his side. It would have to be enough. February came in with a thaw that turned the roads to mud and made everything smell like wet earth and horse manure. Ruby learned the transit the way she'd learned everything else in her life, through necessity and stubbornness. Every evening, after she'd fed the chickens and helped Pearl with her letters and put James down, for the night she'd meet Silas out in the west pasture. He taught her how to level the instrument, how to read the crosshairs, how to calculate distances using mathematics she'd never learned in school. At first her hands shook so bad she couldn't hold the eyepiece steady. But Silas was patient in a way that made her want to try harder, and by the end of the second week, she could measure a fence line within 6 inches. You're getting good at this, he said one evening, watching her sight down a row of markers. Your mama would be proud. Ruby's throat tightened. You really think so? I know so. He paused, then added quietly, she was smart like you, stubborn too. Wouldn't quit once she set her mind to something. Ruby wanted to ask more, what else Silas remembered. What Mama had been like before she became just a name and a photograph. But before she could, Miguel came riding hard across the pasture, his horse's hooves throwing up great clods of mud. Mr. Brennan, town. He was breathing hard. Bank's holding an auction, next Saturday. Dalton Homestead and 6 other properties. Silas's face went still. 6 other properties? All foreclosures. All folks who couldn't make payments through the winter. Miguel dismounted, wiped sweat from his forehead despite the cold. Hargrave's buying up everything he can get his hands on. Why? Don't know, but Mrs. Chen at the general store says he's been meeting with men from Helena, land speculators, she thinks, buying drought land cheap, waiting for rain, then selling at 10 times the price. Ruby felt something cold settle in her stomach. She looked at Silas, saw his jaw tighten, saw him doing calculations she couldn't follow. How much is the Dalton homestead listed at? Starting bid's $47, the back taxes, and $47. It might as well have been $400. Ruby had 17 cents to her name, earned from collecting eggs and selling them to Doc Whitmore. Silas had money, everyone knew that, but spending it on land that might not even belong to him legally was another thing entirely. I'm going to that auction, Silas said. Sir, I'm going, and I'm going to outbid whatever Hargrave offers. He looked at Ruby. That land's yours by right. Time we made sure it stays that way. Saturday arrived bright and cold. The auction was held in the town square, right in front of the bank, where everyone could see who was buying and who was losing their land. A crowd gathered, some curious, some desperate, all of them smelling like wool and coffee, and the particular fear that came with watching your neighbors' lives get sold to the highest bidder. The auctioneer was a thin man with a voice like a rusty hinge. He read off properties one by one, the Morrison farm, the Chen store building, old Widow Keller's house. Each time, Hargrave's agent raised his paddle. Each time, no one bid against him. The prices were insultingly low, and the silence from the crowd said everyone knew it. Then the auctioneer called the Dalton homestead. Quarter section 3 miles east of town. Burned structures, spring-fed creek, timber rights included. Starting bid $47 for back taxes. Hargrave's agent raised his paddle immediately. 47. Do I hear 50? Silas's voice cut through the cold air. 50. The crowd shifted, whispers spreading like wind through dry grass. Hargrave turned slowly, his eyes finding Silas, something dangerous crossing his face. 60, his agent called. 80, Silas said. 100. 150. Ruby stood beside Silas, Pearl's hand in hers, James on her hip. She could feel the weight of every eye in the square, could hear the whispers starting again. Millionaire rancher. Orphan girl. What's he playing at? Her face burned, but she kept her chin up the way Silas had taught her. The bidding climbed. 200, 300, 500. Each time Hargrave's agent raised, Silas countered without hesitation. The auctioneer's voice grew hoarse. The crowd pressed closer. At $800, Hargrave himself stepped forward. He looked directly at Silas, and Ruby saw something in his eyes she recognized. The look of a man who'd been humiliated in front of his whole town and wouldn't forget it. $1,000, Hargrave said. The crowd gasped. $1,000 for a burned-out homestead nobody wanted 6 months ago. It was madness. And everyone knew it, but no one said a word. Silas didn't blink. 1,200, 1,500, 2,000. The silence was absolute. $2,000. More than most men in Crestview made in 5 years. More than the land was worth by any reasonable measure. But this wasn't about land anymore, and everyone watching knew it. Hargrave's jaw worked. His hand clenched at his side. For a long moment, Ruby thought he'd bid higher, keep going until Silas backed down or went bankrupt trying to stop him. Then Hargrave smiled, and Ruby's blood went cold. Let him have it, Hargrave said to his agent. He looked at Silas, that smile never reaching his eyes. Congratulations, Brennan. You just bought the most expensive pile of ashes in Montana. He turned to leave, then paused. Enjoy your charity case, all 3 of them. The auctioneer brought his gavel down. Sold to Mr. Silas Brennan for $2,000. The crowd dispersed slowly, conversations buzzing. Miguel appeared at Silas's elbow, concerned. Sir, that was necessary. Silas's voice was flat. He looked down at Ruby. The land's secure. That's what matters. But Ruby had seen Hargrave's face, had seen the way he looked at them like pieces on a chessboard. He was 3 moves from checkmating. Winning the land should have felt like victory. Instead, it felt like they'd just painted a target on their backs. They were loading into the wagon when Deputy Harris appeared, an official-looking envelope in his hand. Mr. Brennan, I'm sorry about this. Silas took the envelope, opened it. Ruby watched his face go hard as stone. What is it? She asked. Silas folded the paper carefully. Emergency petition for guardianship. Hargrave's claiming I'm exploiting you children for labor. Claiming I'm unfit. He looked at the deputy. When's the hearing? Monday morning, Judge Caldwell. Harris shifted uncomfortably. For what it's worth, I don't believe a word of it. But you have to serve the papers anyway. Yes, sir. They rode home in silence. Ruby held James close, felt Pearl shaking beside her, and wondered how many times you could win before losing became inevitable. That night, after the children were asleep, she heard raised voices from downstairs. Silas and Doc Whitmore arguing about lawyers and evidence and whether $2,000 had just bought them time or dug them deeper into trouble. Ruby pressed her face against the cold window glass and watched clouds cover the moon. 30 days, the judge had said. They'd made it 16. 14 left before everything came apart. Monday morning, Ruby woke before dawn to the sound of Miguel's voice in the kitchen, low and urgent. She crept to the top of the stairs, Pearl and James still sleeping behind her, and listened. Checked the county records like you asked? Found something strange? Strange how? Silas's voice. Dalton homestead deed. Original mortgage was signed 1922, 10 years ago. But the signature... Papers rustled. I've seen your father's handwriting. Ruby's grandfather. This isn't it. Letters are too careful, too practiced. You're saying it's forged? I'm saying it doesn't match the signature on his will, which I saw when old Doc Patterson settled the estate. And there's more. The boundary markers on the property survey, they're 200 yards off from where the legal description says they should be. Silence. Then Silas. Someone moved them. Or never put them in the right place to start with. Either way, if the boundaries are wrong, the foreclosure might be wrong too. Wrong property, wrong debt. Ruby's heart hammered. She knew she should go back to bed, pretend she hadn't heard, but her feet carried her down the stairs before she could think better of it. Both men looked up as she appeared in the doorway. I'm sorry, she said quickly. I didn't mean to listen. Silas studied her for a moment. Then he gestured to a chair. Sit. You should hear this anyway. It's your land. Ruby sat. Miguel spread papers across the table. The mortgage document, a survey map, something else that looked like a will. He pointed to two signatures side by side. See here? The mortgage signature has a flourish on the D your grandfather never used, and the date, April 1922. But according to the county recorder, your grandfather was in Billings that whole month, visiting family. There's hotel receipts. So Hargrave forged it, Ruby said. Forged Grandpa's name to steal the land. Maybe. Or maybe someone at the bank did it for him. Either way, if we can prove the signature's fake and the boundaries are wrong, the foreclosure doesn't hold, Silas finished. The debt doesn't exist. But how do we prove it? Ruby asked. Judge Caldwell's not going to take my word over Hargrave's. Miguel folded the papers carefully. We need an expert, someone who can testify about handwriting, about survey boundaries, and we need to find those original property markers before someone makes them disappear permanently. Silas stood, walked to the window. The sun was just starting to rise, painting the frozen prairie in shades of pink and gold. Spring thaw's coming. Another few weeks and the ground will be soft enough to dig. If those markers are buried, we might be able to find them. That's still after the hearing, Ruby pointed out. I know. Silas turned back to face her. Which means today we focus on what we can control. Doc's testifying about your health. Miguel's bringing the mortgage documents. And you, he looked at Ruby, you're going to tell Judge Caldwell the truth about your father leaving, about trying to survive on your own, about why you were stealing food. Ruby's stomach twisted. They'll ask about Mama. Probably. I don't want to talk about her in front of everyone. I know. But sometimes the only way forward is through the hard thing. He pulled a chair close, sat so he was eye level with her. You're stronger than you think, Ruby May. Your mama knew that? Why else would she name you after a stone that doesn't break? Ruby touched the locket at her throat. Inside was the only photograph she had of Anna Dalton. Young, smiling, holding baby Ruby like she was something precious. A woman who'd died trying to bring James into the world, who'd worked this ranch 15 years ago, for reasons Silas still wouldn't explain. Will you tell me? Ruby asked. About Mama? About why you really took us in? Silas was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was rougher than usual. Your mama saved my daughter's life once, or tried to. Winter of 1917, worst blizzard in 20 years. My Emily, she was 7, same age as Pearl is now, got separated from the house, wandered out into the storm. Your mama found her, brought her back, stayed up all night, keeping her warm. He paused. Emily died anyway. Pneumonia took her 3 days later. But your mama gave us 3 more days with her. 3 days to say goodbye. Ruby felt tears burning behind her eyes. That's why you helped us. You're paying back a debt. It started that way, Silas admitted. But it's not that anymore. You understand? You and Pearl and James, you're not a debt. You're family. Chosen family, which is sometimes the strongest kind. A sound from upstairs, James crying, Pearl's voice trying to soothe him. Ruby stood, wiping her eyes. I should go to them. Ruby. Silas caught her hand. About today. Whatever Hargrave throws at us, whatever the judge asks, remember, you've got nothing to be ashamed of. Surviving isn't a crime, it's a victory. Ruby nodded, not trusting her voice. She went upstairs, got James changed and fed, helped Pearl wash her face and braid her hair. Through the window, she could see the sun climbing higher, burning off the last of the morning frost. 14 days left of their 30-day custody. 14 days to prove they belonged together, that Silas wasn't exploiting them. That family was more than blood and paperwork. 14 days to prove Ruby Mae Dalton wasn't just a charity case, or a burden, or a debt to be paid. She was a girl with a name and a history and a piece of land that was hers by right. And if Clayton Hargrave thought he could take that away with forged signatures and moved property markers, he was about to learn what it meant to fight someone who had nothing left to lose. Ruby straightened Pearl's collar, picked up James, and headed downstairs. Time to go to court. The courthouse smelled different this time. Less like old paper and more like sweat and anger and too many bodies pressed into too small a space. Word had spread about Hargrave's petition, and it seemed like half of Crestview had shown up to watch the millionaire rancher get taken down a notch or see 3 orphans lose their last hope. Ruby couldn't tell which side most people were on. Judge Caldwell looked tired. He listened while Hargrave's lawyer painted a picture of Silas Brennan as a man using children for cheap labor, forcing an 8-year-old to do ranch work, keeping them isolated from proper schooling and socialization. Mr. Brennan has substantial means, the lawyer said, pacing in front of the judge's bench. Yet these children wear donated clothes, eat plain food, and work dawn to dusk. One must ask, where's the benefit to them? Or is this simply a convenient source of unpaid help? Ruby's hands clenched in her lap. Beside her, she felt Silas go very still, the kind of stillness that came before a storm. Then Doc Whitmore stood. "Your Honor, may I address the court?" Judge Caldwell gestured for her to proceed. Doc opened her medical bag, pulled out a leather-bound journal. "I've been treating the Dalton children for 6 weeks now. Weekly checkups, monitoring their recovery." She flipped pages, her voice clinical, precise. "Ruby has gained 11 pounds. Pearl, 9. James, 6. Their colors returned. No more signs of malnutrition or dehydration. James's pneumonia cleared completely." Man, she looked up. "These are not children being exploited. These are children being saved." But the work," Hargrave's lawyer started. "The work is age-appropriate chores that teach responsibility and give them purpose," Doc interrupted. "Ruby collects eggs. Pearl helps with laundry. James is 4 years old and mostly plays. This isn't exploitation, it's parenting." Hargrave stood then, his face carefully neutral. "May I speak, Your Honor?" Judge Caldwell nodded. "No one questions Dr. Whitmore's dedication to these children's physical health. But there are other considerations, legal considerations." He pulled papers from his coat. "The Dalton homestead debt. Mr. Brennan purchased the property at auction for an absurd price, $2,000 for burned ruins. Why? The only logical explanation is that he's positioning himself to claim the children's inheritance once he establishes guardianship." "That's a lie," Ruby said before she could stop herself. The courtroom went quiet. Judge Caldwell looked at her, eyebrows raised. "You have something to say, Miss Dalton?" Ruby stood, her legs shaking. Silas put a hand on her shoulder, not restraining, just steadying. "Mary, Brennan bought our land because it's ours, because Mr. Hargrave was trying to steal it." She pulled the folded papers from her pocket, the ones Miguel had shown her that morning. The mortgage signature's forged. My grandfather's handwriting doesn't match. And the property boundaries are wrong, 200 yards off from where they should be." Hargrave's expression flickered. Just for a second, but Ruby saw it. Surprise, and something else. Worry. "Those are serious allegations," Judge Caldwell said. "Do you have proof?" "We're gathering it," Miguel said, standing. "The spring thaw will expose the original survey markers. If they're where the legal documents say they should be, fine. But if they're 200 yards off," he looked at Hargrave, "then someone's been stealing land for a decade." This is ridiculous," Hargrave said, but his voice had lost some of its certainty. "A child's fantasy based on documents she doesn't understand." "I understand enough," Ruby said. Her voice was stronger now, steadier. "I understand you want our land. I understand you're willing to lie and cheat and take 3 orphans away from the only home they've got to get it. And I understand you're scared, Mr. Hargrave, because for the first time, someone's fighting back." The courtroom erupted in whispers. Judge Caldwell banged his gavel. "Order, Miss Dalton, sit down." He looked at the papers Ruby had placed on his bench, then at Hargrave. "I'm going to order an independent survey of the Dalton property. Expert handwriting analysis of the mortgage signature. Until those results come back, custody remains with Mr. Brennan." Hargrave's jaw tightened. "Your Honor, I must protest." Protest noted and overruled. "This hearing is adjourned pending further investigation." Another gavel strike. "Mr. Hargrave, if there's evidence of fraud, I will pursue it to the fullest extent of the law." "Understood?" Hargrave nodded once, stiff. As the crowd dispersed, he stopped beside Silas, his voice low enough that only those closest could hear. "You think you've won something here, Brennan? You've just made yourself an enemy." "I've been your enemy since I outbid you Saturday," Silas said calmly. "Difference is now everyone knows what you are." Outside, the March wind carried the smell of coming rain. Doc Whitmore squeezed Ruby's shoulder as they walked to the wagon. "You did good in there, girl." Took courage to speak up. Ruby climbed into the wagon bed, let Pearl and James curl against her. She was shaking now, the adrenaline draining away, leaving her hollow and exhausted. But underneath the exhaustion was something else. A small, fierce spark of pride. She'd stood up to Clayton Hargrave in front of the whole town. She'd told the truth even when her voice shook. She'd fought back. That night, as the first rain of spring pattered against the roof, Miguel came to the ranch with news. He'd been talking to Mrs. Chen at the general store, to the blacksmith, to old widow Keller, whose house had been foreclosed. "They're all willing to testify," he said. 6 families who lost land to Hargrave in the last 2 years. All of them suspicious about the boundaries, about the paperwork. All of them ready to tell their stories if it comes to that. And Silas looked out at the rain, at the land turning from frozen gray to living brown. "Spring thaw starts tomorrow. We find those markers, we prove the fraud, we end this." Ruby touched the transit case beside her chair. "When do we start?" "Dawn," Silas said. "Dress warm. We've got a lot of ground to cover." Through the window, lightning flashed. Thunder rumbled in the distance. The rain fell harder, washing away the last of winter's ice, exposing secrets the frozen ground had kept for 10 long years. Tomorrow they'd start digging. The spring thaw came fast and hard, turning the prairie into a mess of mud and rushing water. Silas, Miguel, and Ruby spent 3 days searching the Dalton homestead, using the transit to measure from the legal survey points, following lines that should have led to buried markers but didn't. On the 4th day, Ruby found the first one. It was Pearl who spotted it, actually. A glint of metal in the runoff from the creek. Ruby waded into the cold water, her boots sinking into mud, and pulled out an iron stake corroded green with age. Numbers were stamped into the metal. DNE 1922. Dalton, northeast corner 1922. It's 212 yards from where it should be, Ruby said, peering through the transit. Her hands were steady now, confident. Someone moved it or buried it wrong on purpose. Silas knelt in the mud, examining the stake. This is it. This is proof. He looked at Miguel. We need the county surveyor, official measurement, official record. I'll ride to Helena tomorrow, Miguel said. Bring him back by week's end. They found 2 more markers over the next 3 days. Both displaced, both corroded, both stamped with dates that matched the forged mortgage. By the time the county surveyor arrived, Ruby had documented every measurement, drawn maps that showed exactly how far off the boundaries were, calculated the difference in land value between what the documents claimed and what actually existed. The surveyor, a methodical man named Morrison, spent 2 days confirming Ruby's work. When he finished, he looked at her with something like respect. You've got a gift for this, young lady. These measurements are exact. He rolled up his maps. This report goes to Judge Caldwell tomorrow. If I were Mr. Hargrave, I'd be getting my affairs in order. But that night, as Ruby lay in bed listening to Pearl's soft breathing, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. They'd won, or were about to win. The evidence was clear, the fraud undeniable. Hargrave would lose his claim to the land, maybe face criminal charges. So why did she feel like they were standing on the edge of a cliff? The answer came at dawn. Ruby woke to shouting, to the smell of smoke. She ran to the window and saw flames, orange and vicious, eating through the barn's west side. Silas and Miguel were already out there with buckets, but the fire was spreading fast, driven by wind that shouldn't have been blowing that direction. She got Pearl and James up, got them downstairs and outside, away from the house. Doc Whitmore appeared from somewhere, wrapped a blanket around them, held them close while Ruby ran to help. The barn was lost, they knew it within minutes. The question was whether they could save the house, the stables, everything else. Neighbors started arriving. Men Ruby had seen at church, at the courthouse. People who'd watched her stand up to Hargrave and apparently decided she was worth saving. They formed a bucket line from the well to the fire, passing water hand over hand, soaking the ground between the barn and the other buildings. The heat was intense, the smoke choking. Ruby's hands blistered, her lungs burned, but she kept going because stopping meant losing everything. It took 3 hours to contain the fire. By the time the last ember died, the barn was gone, nothing left but blackened timbers and the acrid smell of burned wood. They stood in the mud, soot-faced and exhausted, watching smoke curl up into the gray morning sky. This wasn't an accident, Miguel said quietly. He pointed to where the fire had started. See, multiple points of origin. Someone set this deliberately. Silas's face was hard as stone. Hargrave. Can't prove it, but yeah, probably. Miguel kicked at a piece of charred wood. He knows the survey report goes to the judge today. He's trying to scare us off, make us think fighting him isn't worth the cost. Ruby looked at the ruins of the barn, at the scared faces of Pearl and James, at Silas's blistered hands. Everything they'd worked for, everything they'd built, Hargrave would burn it all down rather than admit defeat. And suddenly, Ruby understood something that made her stomach turn cold. This wasn't about land or money or even pride. This was about power. About a man who'd built his life on cheating people and couldn't afford to let anyone prove it. If they exposed him, if they won, every person he'd ever swindled would come forward. His whole empire would collapse. He'd do anything to stop that. Anything. We should pull back, she said. Her voice sounded strange, distant. Drop the case. Let him have the land. Silas turned to her, sharp. What? He burned your barn. Next time it could be the house. Could be us. She looked at Pearl and James, still wrapped in Doc's blanket, their eyes huge with fear. I won't let them get hurt because of me. Ruby? He wins, Mr. Brennan. He always wins, because he's willing to do things we're not. She felt tears burning behind her eyes. Maybe that's just how the world works. Maybe fighting back just makes it worse. Silas knelt in the mud, in front of her, put his hands on her shoulders. You listen to me, Ruby Mae Dalton. The world is full of men like Hargrave who win because good people get scared and back down. And maybe you're right. Maybe fighting back makes it worse before it gets better. But if we don't fight, if we let him take what's yours because we're afraid, then we're teaching Pearl and James that bullies always win, that might makes right, that there's no point in standing up for yourself. What if someone dies? Ruby whispered. What if we live the rest of our lives as cowards? He stood, helped her to her feet. The survey report goes to Judge Caldwell today. Tomorrow we make our case. And if Hargrave wants to burn down the whole county to stop us, let him try. We're not backing down. Ruby looked at the smoking ruins, at the neighbors who'd stayed to help, at Miguel and Doc and Silas standing beside her like a wall against the dark. Okay, she said. We fight. Behind them, the sun broke through the clouds, illuminating the destruction. But in that light, Ruby could also see green shoots pushing up through the mud. New grass, unstoppable, growing despite everything. Spring had come. And with it, the reckoning. The final hearing was set for Friday morning, 10 days after the barn fire. Those 10 days felt like holding your breath underwater, every moment stretched thin, waiting for the next attack that didn't come. Hargrave had gone quiet, which somehow felt more dangerous than his threats. The courthouse was packed, every seat filled, people standing along the walls, craning to see. Ruby sat at the front table beside Silas, the brass transit in its case at her feet. Her hands were still bandaged from the fire, but they didn't shake anymore. Judge Caldwell entered, his gray face grimmer than usual. We're here to resolve the matter of guardianship for the Dalton children and to review evidence regarding the Dalton homestead foreclosure. He looked at the county surveyor. Mr. Morrison, your report. Morrison stood, unrolled his maps across the judge's bench. Your Honor, I've completed a comprehensive survey of the Dalton property. The findings are conclusive. The property markers referenced in the 1922 mortgage are displaced by an average of 206 yards from their legally documented positions. This displacement results in a land value discrepancy of approximately 40%. Murmurs rippled through the courtroom. Judge Caldwell studied the maps. 40%? You're saying the foreclosed property is worth 40% more than the mortgage claimed? Correct. And there's more. Morrison pulled out photographs. These markers show evidence of deliberate repositioning. Tool marks on the metal, disturbed soil layers, inconsistent with original placement. Someone moved these markers after the property was surveyed and before the mortgage was filed. Who surveyed the property in 1922? Morrison hesitated. According to county records, the survey was conducted by Hargrave Land Company, Mr. Clayton Hargrave's firm. The murmurs became shouts. Judge Caldwell's gavel cracked like a gunshot. Order! Hargrave's lawyer stood quickly. Your Honor, this is circumstantial at best. My client's company conducted hundreds of surveys in that period. Minor errors in marker placement are. 200 yards isn't a minor error, Judge Caldwell cut in. It's fraud. He looked at Hargrave. Do you have an explanation, Mr. Hargrave? Hargrave stood, his face pale but composed. Mistakes happen, Your Honor. If there was an error in the original survey, I'm happy to correct it, but that doesn't invalidate the debt. The Daltons still owe. The Daltons don't owe anything, Ruby said, standing. Her voice cut through the noise. Because my grandfather never signed that mortgage. She nodded to Miguel, who brought forward two documents, the mortgage and the will. Set them side by side on the judge's bench. Look at the signatures. The D in Dalton. In Grandpa's real signature, it's plain, simple. In the mortgage signature, there's a flourish. An extra loop. Her finger traced the difference. In the date, April 1922, but Grandpa was in Billings all that month. There's hotel receipts, train tickets. He couldn't have signed this mortgage because he wasn't even in Montana. Judge Caldwell examined both documents carefully, pulled out a magnifying glass, compared them stroke by stroke. The silence in the courtroom was absolute. Miss Dalton is correct. These signatures don't match. He looked up at Hargrave, and something in his expression made Ruby's breath catch. Me, Hargrave, did you forge this mortgage? No, Your Honor. Did someone in your employ forge it? I don't know. The company has many employees. Record keeping from 10 years ago is conveniently lost, I'm sure. Judge Caldwell set down the magnifying glass. Here's what I see, Mr. Hargrave. Displaced survey markers. Forged signatures. A pattern of foreclosures on properties your company surveyed. And a barn that mysteriously burned down 3 days after evidence of this fraud surfaced. He leaned forward. Would you like to revise your testimony? Hargrave's jaw worked, his hands clenched on the table. Ruby watched him calculate, saw him weighing his options, confess and face criminal charges, or maintain the lie and hope the judge couldn't prove intent. I want to speak, said a woman's voice from the back. Everyone turned. Mrs. Hargrave stood, her face pale, her hands twisting a handkerchief. She'd avoided Ruby's eyes at church, had never spoken to her directly. Now she walked slowly down the aisle, her heels clicking on the wooden floor. "Your Honor, I have information relevant to this case. Mrs. Hargrave." Clayton started, but she cut him off with a look. "I've kept silent for 10 years, watching my husband cheat families out of their land, watching him forge documents and move survey markers and threaten anyone who questioned him." Her voice shook. "But I won't watch him destroy 3 orphaned children to cover his crimes. And Julia, don't. He forged the Dalton mortgage. I saw him do it. April 1922, in his office, practicing the signature over and over until he got it right." She looked at Judge Caldwell. "And he's done it 16 times since. 16 families who lost their land to foreclosures based on fraudulent documents." The courtroom erupted. Judge Caldwell's gavel rang out again and again. Hargrave lunged toward his wife, but 2 deputies grabbed him, held him back. "You stupid. You've ruined everything." "You ruined everything," Julia said quietly. "I'm just done pretending you didn't." Judge Caldwell stood. "Hargrave, you're under arrest for fraud, forgery, and conspiracy. Deputies, take him into custody." He looked at the courtroom, at the shocked faces of people who'd watched Hargrave run this town for a decade. "This court will conduct a full investigation of all foreclosures involving Hargrave Land Company. Any party who believes they were defrauded should file a claim with the county clerk." Hargrave was still shouting as the deputies dragged him out, his voice echoing off the courthouse walls. But Ruby barely heard it. She was watching Julia Hargrave, who stood alone in the aisle, her handkerchief pressed to her mouth, her shoulders shaking. Doc Whitmore went to her, put an arm around her, led her gently to a seat. And Ruby thought, courage doesn't always look like fighting. Sometimes it looks like telling the truth when staying silent would be easier. Judge Caldwell turned to Ruby. "Miss Dalton, the Dalton homestead debt is hereby declared null and void. The property is yours, free and clear, and as for guardianship," he looked at Silas. "Mr. Brennan, your petition for permanent adoption is granted. These children are legally yours." And the word hung in the air. Adoption. Not temporary custody, not guardianship. Family. Ruby felt Silas's hand on her shoulder, steady and warm. Felt Pearl grab her other hand. Heard James ask in his small voice, "Does this mean we get to stay?" "Yes, baby," Ruby whispered. "We get to stay." The courtroom slowly emptied. People stopped to shake Silas's hand, to tell Ruby she was brave, to whisper that they'd known all along Hargrave was crooked. Miguel and Doc waited by the door, smiling. Even Mrs. Gunderson paused on her way out, nodded stiffly at Ruby. "You did well, girl. Your mama would be proud." It was the kindest thing she'd ever said. Outside, the April sun was warm on Ruby's face. The mud had dried to dust, and green grass pushed up along the roadside. Spring, real spring, not just the thaw, but the growing season, the time when things that had been buried all winter finally broke through into light. Silas loaded the transit case into the wagon. "You know what this means?" "What?" "Your land's yours now. Quarter section with a spring-fed creek. Question is, what do you want to do with it?" Ruby looked at Pearl and James climbing into the wagon bed, at Miguel helping Doc up to the seat, at the town of Crestview spread out below them, still flawed, still complicated, but maybe a little more honest than it had been yesterday. "I want to rebuild," she said. "The homestead, make it a real home again." "That's a big job." "I know," she smiled. "But I've got help now. I've got family." Silas returned the smile. "That you do, Ruby May. That you do." They drove home as the sun climbed higher, burning off the last of the morning clouds. And for the first time since her mother died, since her father left, since everything fell apart, Ruby felt something settle in her chest. Not hope exactly, but something steadier, something that would last. She was home, finally, truly home. The rebuilding started the next week. Not just the Dalton homestead, but 6 other properties that Hargrave had stolen through forged documents. Judge Caldwell ordered the land returned to the original families, ordered restitution from Hargrave's seized assets. It wouldn't make anyone whole, couldn't give back the years lost, the lives disrupted, but it was something. It was justice, imperfect but real. Ruby spent her mornings at the ranch helping with chores, her afternoons at the homestead with Silas and Miguel and whoever else showed up to help. Turned out a lot of people showed up. The Morrisons brought lumber from their mill. Doc Whitmore organized the church ladies to provide meals. Even Mrs. Gunderson arrived one day with curtain fabric and an almost apology about misjudging Ruby at the potluck. You're tougher than you look," she said, which was probably the closest to praise she'd ever get. By mid-May, the Saudis' foundation was rebuilt, the frame started. It wouldn't be finished before winter. Silas said, realistically, they were looking at next spring for completion. But that was all right. Ruby had learned patience, had learned that some things worth having took time to build. She still lived at Silas's ranch, still shared a room with Pearl, still got up early to collect eggs and help with breakfast. But now, when she walked through the house, when she sat at the table for meals. When Silas asked her opinion about which calves to keep and which to sell, it felt different, not like being a guest or a charity case or someone passing through. It felt like being home. One evening in late May, after the chores were done and Pearl and James were asleep, Ruby found Silas on the porch. He was sitting in his chair, the one that fit his body like an old glove, watching the sunset paint the sky pink and gold. "Can I ask you something?" Ruby settled on the step beside him. "Always. That day, you found me in the root cellar. You said Mama's name. You knew her." Silas was quiet for so long, Ruby thought he wouldn't answer. Then he said, "I loved her." And the words hung between them, simple and devastating. "Not the way you're thinking," he continued. "Nothing improper. She worked here one winter after your grandmother died. Your grandfather couldn't manage the farm alone with a baby, so Anna came to earn money. She was 17, smart as a whip, stubborn as a mule." He smiled at the memory. "Reminded me of someone." What happened?" "She met your father, Thomas Dalton. He was working the rail yard, saving to buy his own place. They fell in love, hard and fast the way young people do. Got married that spring, and she left to start her life." He paused. "Emily got sick a few months later. The blizzard hit, and your mama, Anna, she heard about it somehow, rode 3 miles through that storm to help, stayed with us, kept Emily warm, did everything she could. But Emily died anyway, 3 days later. But those 3 days mattered. We got to say goodbye, got to tell her we loved her. That was Anna's gift to us." His voice roughened. When my wife left, couldn't handle the grief, couldn't stay in a house full of memories. Anna wrote me a letter. Said grief was proof of love, that carrying it was the price we pay for caring. Said I should keep going, keep living, because Emily would have wanted that." Ruby felt tears sliding down her face. "You kept the letter?" "Still have it. Read it sometimes when the house feels too empty." He looked at her. "So when I saw that locket, saw Anna's face looking out at me from around your neck, I knew. Knew who you were, knew what I owed. Knew I couldn't let Anna's children die when she'd fought so hard to save mine." "The debt," Ruby whispered. "Started as a debt, became something else pretty fast." He reached over, squeezed her shoulder. "You're not Anna's ghost, Ruby. You're your own person, strong and smart and brave. But you've got her stubbornness, her refusal to quit. That's a gift she left you." They sat in silence, watching the sun sink lower. Behind them, through the open door, Ruby could hear Pearl talking in her sleep, could hear James's soft snoring, the sounds of family, the sounds of home. "Silas?" She used his first name deliberately, testing how it felt. "Thank you for everything. For saving us, for fighting for us, for," her voice caught, "for choosing us. Thank you for letting me," he said. "For trusting an old widower who didn't know what he was doing half the time. For being patient while I figured out how to be a father again. You're good at it." "I'm learning." "We all are." The next morning, Ruby woke early and walked out to where they'd buried the surveyor's transit case in the barn's foundation. The old barn, the one that burned. She'd asked Silas if she could have it, if she could keep it somewhere safe. He'd helped her dig a hole, wrap the case in oilcloth, bury it deep where fire couldn't touch it. "Why bury it?" he'd asked. "So it's always here. So if something happens, if we lose everything again, we can dig it up and remember. Remember we survived. Remember we won." Now she stood over that spot, feeling the warm May sun on her face, and thought about everything that had changed since January. She'd been a girl, stealing rotten apples, half-starved, desperate, alone. Now she was Ruby Mae Dalton Brennan, adopted daughter, landowner, survivor. She heard footsteps behind her, Pearl and James, still in their nightclothes, rubbing sleep from their eyes. "What are you doing out here?" Pearl asked. "Remembering." Remembering what?" Ruby knelt down, pulled them both close. "Remembering how we got here. Remembering Mama and Papa and everything we lost, but also remembering everything we found." She looked at the house, at Silas's silhouette in the kitchen window. "Remembering that family isn't just blood, it's who shows up when you need them. Who fights for you, who chooses you." James tugged on her sleeve. "Are we really staying forever?" "Forever," Ruby confirmed. "And nobody can take us away?" "Nobody. We're Brennans now, legal and everything." Pearl was quiet for a moment, then she said, "I miss Papa sometimes. Is that wrong?" "No, honey. It's not wrong. We can miss Papa and love Silas both. Love doesn't run out. It just grows to fit whoever needs it." They walked back to the house together. 3 children who'd survived winter and come out the other side, stronger. Inside, Silas had breakfast ready, eggs and bacon and fresh bread, the smell filling the kitchen with warmth. Miguel arrived for the day's work, bringing news that the Morrison family had finished their new barn, that Widow Keller had moved back into her house, that Hargrave was being transferred to the territorial prison in Deer Lodge. Good riddance, Miguel said, pouring coffee. Ruby thought about Julia Hargrave, living alone now in that big house, ostracized by the same people who'd once courted her favor. Doc said she was thinking about moving east, starting over somewhere nobody knew her name. Ruby hoped she did. Hoped she found whatever peace looked like for a woman who'd done the right thing, too late but had done it anyway. After breakfast, they all piled into the wagon, Silas driving, Miguel riding alongside, the children bouncing in the back, and headed to the homestead. The frame was up now, the walls starting to take shape. It wouldn't be the house Mama grew up in, wouldn't be the home Papa had tried and failed to keep. It would be something new, built by hands that chose to help, held together by more than nails and lumber. Ruby climbed down from the wagon, grabbed her work gloves, looked at the raw timber and open sky and the long day of work ahead. "Where do we start?" she asked. Silas handed her a hammer. "Same place we always start, with what needs doing." So they started. Pearl fetching nails, James hauling water for the workers, Ruby and Miguel framing walls, while Silas supervised and adjusted and told stories that made everyone laugh. The work was hard, the sun hot, but nobody complained. This was what surviving looked like after you'd done the surviving. This was what came next: building, growing, living. By evening, the western wall was finished, solid and straight. They stood back to admire it, sweaty and satisfied, as the sun set behind them. Tomorrow, they'd start the eastern wall. Day after that, the roof frame. Week after that, the windows. One piece at a time, one day at a time, until it was done, until it was home. 2 years later, Ruby stood in the doorway of the completed homestead, watching Pearl teach James how to use the surveyor's transit. They dug it up from the barn foundation last spring, cleaned the brass until it gleamed, set it up on a tripod in the west pasture. James was 9 now, tall enough to reach the eyepiece without standing on his toes. Pearl was 13, patient as she adjusted his grip, showed him how to sight down the crosshairs. "See those markers?" Pearl's voice carried on the warm June breeze. "Papa Silas and Ruby placed those. Now we're learning so we can do it ourselves?" Papa Silas. The name had stuck, natural as breathing. Silas had adopted them legally 2 years ago, but the paperwork just made official what had been true since that first morning in the root cellar. They were family, chosen, fought for, earned through fire family. Ruby touched the door frame where she'd carved their initials last summer: RMDB, PDB, JDB, SB. 4 sets of letters, 4 lives, braided together. Beneath them, in smaller script, she'd added AD 1917, Anna Dalton. So Mama would always be part of this place, this home they'd built from ashes and stubbornness and the kind of love that refused to quit. The homestead was small but solid. 3 rooms, a good roof, a stone fireplace that drew clean. Ruby lived here now most days, managing the land, overseeing the spring-fed creek that watered cattle from 3 neighboring ranches. Silas had deeded her the property on her 16th birthday with one condition: that she never sell it to pay someone else's debts, that she remember where she came from and never let anyone make her ashamed of it. She wouldn't, couldn't. The scars on her hands from that January night, from frozen ground and rotten apples and the desperation of trying to keep siblings alive, those scars were part of her now, proof that she'd survived, proof that surviving was worth something. Doc Whitmore's wagon appeared on the eastern road, dust rising behind it. She came every Sunday for dinner, a tradition they'd started that first spring and never stopped. Miguel and his family would arrive soon after, and Mrs. Chin from the general store, and even Mrs. Gunderson on occasion, though she still couldn't quite bring herself to admit she'd been wrong about Ruby. That was all right. Ruby had learned you didn't need everyone's approval, just the people who mattered. The wind shifted, carrying the smell of sage and warm grass and the particular sweetness of land that knew rain. Ruby breathed it in, let it fill her lungs. 16 years old, and she owned a quarter section, managed livestock contracts, taught surveying to anyone who asked. 16 years old, and she'd testified in 3 more fraud cases, helped 4 families reclaim stolen land, earned a reputation as someone who wouldn't back down from a fight worth fighting. But more than that, more than the land, or the reputation, or even the justice, she had this moment, Pearl's patient voice, James's laugh when he finally got the measurement right, Silas's silhouette in the ranch house window a mile west, watching over them like he'd done since that first frozen morning. She had family, had home, had a future she'd claimed with her own 2 hands. Doc's wagon pulled up. She climbed down, medical bag in one hand, a covered dish in the other. "Ruby May, you look like you're thinking deep thoughts." "Just remembering." "Remembering what?" Ruby smiled. "How far we've come, how close we came to losing everything, how we didn't." Doc set down her bag, squeezed Ruby's shoulder. You saved yourself, girl. Don't forget that. Silas gave you shelter, but you did the surviving. We did the surviving, Ruby corrected. All of us together. Fair enough. Doc looked out at Pearl and James at the land spreading green and gold to the horizon. Your mama would be proud. What you've built here, what you've become. Ruby thought about that letter Mama had written Silas, about grief being proof of love, about carrying it forward. She thought about the locket she still wore, about carved initials and barn beams, about the weight of brass transits and the smell of turned earth and all the small, fierce ways the past held hands with the present. I hope so, she said. I hope wherever she is, she knows we made it, that we're okay. That the apples we eat now are fresh and sweet and ours. Because that was the thing about surviving. It wasn't just about making it through the winter. It was about what you built when spring came, what you grew, who you chose to become when the choice was finally yours. Ruby had chosen this land, this family, this life, where she measured her own worth instead of letting others do it for her. And standing in the doorway of a home built from nothing but will and weather, in the stubborn refusal to surrender, Ruby Mae Dalton Brennan knew one thing for certain. She'd chosen right.